Beloved childhood writer Roald Dahl once said, "Somewhere inside all of us is the power to change the world." In the United States of America, we have that very power: voting. When we vote, we elect the next officials who will lead our country. And even though there's a misconception that voting really can't do anything, it actually serves as the butterfly that can create a hurricane. And throughout history, Americans have fought to give everyone the right and access to voting, such as the suffragists in the early 1900s and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement. And even though we've come a long way compared to the beginning, we've still got a long ways to go. Even in the year 2020, informal and formal barriers stand that prevent some Americans from voting.
We'll start from the beginning. In the early 1700s and 1800s, the only Americans who had the right to vote were white males. After the Civil War ended in the mid-1800s, more and more started to stand up and demand for equality. We see this in the infamous Supreme Court cases of Minor v. Happersett and Elk v. Wilkins. In Minor v. Happersett, the Supreme Court held that the Constitution did not grant anyone, and in this case specifically a female citizen of the state of Missouri, a right to vote, even when a state law granted rights to vote to a certain class of citizens. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the right of suffrage was not protected by the Privileges and Immunities Clause found in the 14th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. This is what happened in Elk v. Wilkins of 1884. John Elk was a Winnebago Indian who was born on Native American Indian territory, but later lived alongside other Americans on non-reserves, where he claimed his U.S. citizenship with the Citizenship Clause. Elk attempted to register to vote in 1880 and was denied by Charles Wilkins. The question of the case was whether or not American Indians were citizens of the United States. The court decided that American Indians were not direct citizens because they first held loyalties to their tribes first. They decided that Elk was not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States at birth.
There's also some laws that have helped elevate voting. For example, in 2018, Florida passed their Voting Rights Restoration for Felons initiative. In this, all people who had prior felony convictions, excluding murder or sexual offense, could have the right to vote after completing their sentences, whether it was prison, parole, or probation. By doing so, Florida added another voting bloc in their state and allowed for more people to get their voices heard, which could potentially influence whether the state turns blue or red.
In 2013, Colorado passed their Voter Access in Motorized Elections Act. The act allowed in-person same-day voting registration and extended the time that one could register by mail, online, DMV, or voter registration agency, and shortened the state residency requirements for voter registration.
And though we no longer have Jim Crow laws or grandfather clauses, which physically restrained some from voting, we have our own borders today. For example, those who are undocumented or dubbed as aliens do not get the right to vote. And this has a huge effect on elections, considering the fact that in some states, such as California, Texas, and Florida, where huge populations of undocumented citizens live, this could swing either way if they were given the right to let their voices get heard.
There's also certain states, often in the Midwest, where people are spread apart and far away from each other. Social isolation limits networking to support and encourage political participation and oftentimes makes some unaware or uninformed about political news.
But how can we make voting easier and more accessible? Well, we've come up with a few solutions. First, we could change Election Day. As of now, Election Day is always on a Tuesday, which is in the middle of the week. This makes it very difficult for many Americans who work 9-to-5 jobs to come out and stand in a long line to vote. If we moved Election Day to the weekend, it would ease that burden. More people would come out to vote.
We could also expand or allow more early voting. A lot of Americans are unable to take time away from their work or family life to vote. So, if we expanded the current voting time, it would create more opportunities to vote. We could also solve this issue by offering online voting, which would provide a direct and quick way to get voices heard.
Don't forget, voting is your way to change the world.